this is what we did yesterday, and if you missed that yesterday class, the recording has been made available so that you can watch and then catch up with what we are doing.
Okay,
Okay, you can watch and then catch up
with what
with
we are
what we are
doing.
doing.
And then for us to
And
start
then
this
for us to
evening,
start this evening, I'm going to cut,
these two
delete
things,
these two
we'll bring them
things.
back.
We'll bring them back,
But let's
but
do it
let's do it
bit by
bit
bit,
by
okay?
bit, okay?
Instead
Instead
of
of
deleting
deleting
them,
them, let
let
me
me just
just
pull this back
pull this back
to
to
this.
this.
Forgot
Okay,
paste. I don't
paste.
understand.
No understand.
Hey, hold
Hey,
on.
hold on. Network.
Okay, let's give the
Okay,
VS
let's
Code
give
a
the
little
VS
time
Code a
to
little time
finish
to
loading.
finish loading.
All right,
All right,
yesterday
yesterday we
basically
basically
started
started
our
our
installation. We did our
installation. We did our
installation with
installation with
Vite,
Vits, which is React,
React,
and
not
Vits, not
Next.
Next.
That would
That
enable
would
us to
enable us to
focus on
focus
pure
on
React
pure React
concept
concept
without trying to
without
mix
trying to
things
mix
up.
things up.
Okay, and like
Okay,
I
and like I
said,
said,
if you want to
if you want to
learn
learn
about
about
um,
um,
Next,
Next,
then as we
then as we
progress,
progress,
we can
we
focus
can
on that,
focus on that,
and then
and then
the knowledge
the
will be
knowledge will be
balanced
balanced
instead of
instead of
replacing pure
replacing
React
pure React
with
knowledge
Next
with Next
JS.
JS.
So I'm going to
So
pull
I'm
these
going to
two
pull these
things
two
back
things
here.
back
So
here.
these
So these
components, I'm going
components,
to
I'm going to
get rid
get
of
rid
them.
of them.
Hey, what's
Hey,
going on
what's
here?
going on here?
So
So
these
these
packages we
packages,
installed
we
all of
installed
them
all of them
yesterday,
yesterday,
and our
and our
focus
focus
is on this
is on this
app.jsx.
app.jsx.
So let's try
So
to
let's try
run
to run
npm
npm
run dev
run dev
to spin
to
up
spin
our
up our
application.
application.
So the
So the
application is
application is
running on
running
this
on
port
this port
5173.
5173.
So I'm going to
So I'm
copy
going to copy
this,
this, open it
in a new
in a
tab
new
right
tab
here,
right here,
and that should
and
give
that
us
should give us
what we
what
want.
we want.
Okay, so
Okay,
this
so
is
this is
so this is what we
so this
have,
is what we have,
and
and
all right, we
all
have
right,
this
we have this
button,
button,
we have the
we have
button,
the
and we have
button, and we have
our
our
H1
H1
element
element
with this
with
paragraph.
this paragraph.
Okay,
Okay,
so what we are going
so
to
what we are
start
going to
from
start from
today
today
is
is we're going to
pull some
pull
data
some
from
data from
this
this
sleep
sleep
advice.
advice.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, I
the
think that's the
URL.
URL.
Sleep
Sleep ad
yes,
okay,
advice
yes.
sleep
Advice sleep
is an
is
API
an API
that we are going to
that we're going
use,
to use.
and
And
based on
based on
the JavaScript
the
concept
JavaScript
that we
concept
learned
that we learned
for that will
for
guide us to
that will guide us to
understand
understand
the
the
React very
React
well.
very well.
So I'm going to
So I'm
use
going to
an
use
async
an async
function
function
to help us
to
pull
help us
data
pull
out of
data out
this
of this
API.
API.
And that async
And that
function I'm
async
going to
function I'm going to
declare.
declare.
I'm going to
I'm
create it
going to
here.
create it here.
So
So
I'll create an
I'll
async
create an async
function which I will
function which
call
I will call
let's just call
this
this
advice sleep.
okay.
Okay,
Just like
just
this.
like this is
Same.
seen.
All right.
All right.
So this is
So
it.
this is
And let
it.
me also
And let me
open the
also
dev
open the
tool
dev tool
on the browser.
on the browser.
All right.
All
Right
right,
here we'll
right
be watching
here we'll be
out for
watching out for
errors while
errors
this
while
is what we are
this is
doing
what we
and
are
this is
doing
our
and this is our
code right
code
here.
right here.
So
So
we're going to
we
use
are going
the
to use the
we're going to
we
use
are going to use
fetch to pull out
fetch to pull
data
out
from that
data from that
API
API
like
like
this, and
this,
I will store
and I'll
this
store this
in a
in a
response
response
variable.
variable.
So
So because it's a sync,
just want to be
just
sure
want
that
to be sure
everything
that
is
everything
working
is
fine.
working
So is
fine. So is
Chibundo
Chibundo
there?
in the class, please?
Chibundo, are you there?
Chibundo, are you there?
He's not here, sir.
Okay,
Okay.
because it's the eyes
Because
of
it's
the
the eyes of the
gods.
gods.
So
So
Josephine, look out
Josephine,
for
look out for
any error.
any error.
Hmm? You understand what
Hmm?
I
You
mean?
understand what I mean?
Yes, sir.
So look out
So
for
look out for
any
any
typo
typo
that is
that
so
is
because this is
so
an
because this is an
async function
async
we're going to
function we are going
use,
to use await here,
and
and
this basically
this
is going to
basically is going to
return
return
something. It's going to
something. It's
pull
going
out
to
some
pull out
data
some
from the
data from the
API.
API.
And now,
And
if
now,
I
if
log
I
out,
log out, if I log out
what is
what
returned from
is
the API,
returned from the API,
and I refresh.
and I refresh.
Oh, sorry, I've
Oh,
not yet
sorry,
called this
I'm here to
function.
call this function.
So let me just put the
So let me
function
just put
in
the
this
function in
button
this
by
button
using the
by using
on
the
click
on click
events, and
events,
here
and
I'll just call
here
it
I'll just call it
advice sleep.
advice sleep.
So
So
when I click
when
on this
I click on
button,
this button,
you see
you
this is the
see, this
response we
is
are
the
getting
response
from
we
the
are getting
API.
from
And
the
if I
API. And if I
expand it, there are
expand
a
it,
whole
there
lot
are
of
a whole
things
lot
that
of things that really
do not
do not
add up. As
add
in,
up.
it doesn't
As
make
in, it
sense
doesn't make sense
to us.
to us.
So for us to
So for
narrow
us to
our data
narrow our
down
data
to
down to
make
something that will
sense,
make sense,
we have
we
to
have to convert whatever is
returned from the
returned from the
API
API
into
into
JavaScript
JavaScript's
notation
notation
objects into a
objects
JSON
into a
file,
JSON file,
and
and
we are going to
we are
store
going to
that
store that
into
into
a variable
a variable
that is called
that is called
data.
data.
So that is what
So
this
that is what
line
this
of code
line of code
is doing.
is doing.
It is
So it
turning
is turning
what
what
is pulled
is
out
pulled out
from the
from the
API
API
into
into
a JSON
a
file.
JSON file.
So if
So if
in that
in that
case I
case
log
I
out
log out
this data,
this data, So,
Is await, not wait.
Oh, thank
oh,
you.
thank you, thank you,
That's your
thank
data,
you,
yes.
Thank you.
thank you.
So
So,
at this point,
at
if I
this
log
point,
out,
if I log out the data and I click,
hold on.
hold
If I click
on, if
this
I click this
button,
button,
now we have
now we
an
have an
object.
object.
So all
So
those big,
all
big
those big, big
something,
something, plenty, plenty
have
things
been
have
reduced
been
down to
reduced down
something
into
more
something more
meaningful,
meaningful,
which
which
is an
is an
object.
object,
And we have
and
a
we have a
sleep.
sleep.
Inside the
Inside
sleep,
the sleep,
we have
we have
advice. And you
advice,
see,
and you see,
the API
the
helps
API
us to
helps us to
return
return
random
random
advice.
advice.
This is the
This is
advice.
the
This is
advice,
the
this is the
ID.
ID.
If I
If
click
I click
again,
again,
you see
you
it will
see it
generate
will
another
generate
one
another
at
one at a
random.
random,
Sorry, not
sorry,
this
not
one.
this one,
This one.
this
You see,
one. You
this is
see, this
another
is another
advice
advice
right here
right
with
here with
different
different
ID.
ID.
So
So
for us to
for us
now
to now
narrow our
narrow
data
our
down,
data
if we want to
down,
narrow it
if we want to
down
narrow it
to
down
the
to
advice
the
itself,
advice
we have to
itself,
access
then we
the
have to
sleep
access the
object.
sleep object.
Inside the sleep,
Inside the
we
sleep,
now
we
access
now
our
access our
advice. So
advice. So here we
data
say
dot
data
sleep.
dot
Hi,
sleep.
your screen is off, sir.
So
We
we are
are
trying
now
to
trying to
get
get
our
our
advice.
advice.
Okay.
Okay,
So to access
so to
it,
access it,
data, which is
data,
the
which is the
object
object
returned, inside
returned,
it we
inside
have
it we have
sleep
sleep
dot
dot
advice.
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 So we have
So we
V
have
right
V
here.
right here.
So like
So like
this, if I
this, if
refresh
I
this
refresh this
page
page
and
and
I click
I
the
click the
button,
button,
at this point now
at
it
this
will
point now
return
it
for
will
us
return for
just
us
the
just the
advice, no
advice,
longer
no longer
the JSON
the
file.
JSON
If I
file.
click
If I
again,
click again,
to return
to return
random
random
advice.
advice.
So
So
our
our
API
API
setup
setup
is
is
good.
good.
That's all we need
That's all
for
we need for
this.
this.
What is it
What
called?
is it
That's
called?
all we need
That's all
for
we need
this
for this
function, the
function, the
async
async
function.
function.
But then
But
we
then we
want
want
this
this
advice to be
advice to be
passed to the
passed to the
screen.
screen.
Okay,
Okay,
that is
that
where
is where
state
state
comes in.
comes in.
Okay,
Okay,
and
and
there's a
there
video
is a video
tutorial I
tutorial
shared
I shared
about
about data or
data
data
objects and
objects
data
and data
sets,
sets.
and those
And
that
those
watched
that
it see
watched it
that
see that
with data
with data
objects in
objects in
JavaScript, you are
JavaScript, you are
able to
able to
monitor the
monitor the
states of
states of
elements, and you are
elements, and you
able
are
to
able to
change and
change and
update that
update that
state
state
depending on
depending on
certain
certain
actions
actions that it
that's been
that's been
taken.
taken.
So
So
we need
we need
states in
states
this
in this
React
React
in
in
order
order
to
to
update the
update the
UI.
UI.
And
And
states
states
is
is
a
a
is made up
is
of
made
the
up of the
structured array,
structured array,
which
which
includes the
includes the
states
states
variable
variable
and the
and the
states
states
function.
function.
So
So
what I'll
what I'll
do
do,
so
so
what I'll
what I'll
do
do
is that
is that
up
up
here
here
I'm going
I'm
to
going to
create
create
a
a
state.
state.
Okay,
Okay,
we're going to
we're going to
call
call
use
use
states,
states,
and
and
mine is
mine is
automatically
automatically
imported up here.
imported up here.
So import
So import
use state
use
from
state
React.
from
So
React.
if
So
yours
if
is not
yours is not
automatically
automatically
imported, you
imported,
have
you
to
have to
import it.
import it.
So this use
So this
state
use states
we start off
we
with
start off with
an
an
empty
empty
string,
string,
and then
and then
because it
because it
is
is
a
a
destructured
destructured
array,
array,
we have
we
to
have to
pass in
pass
this
in this
with angle
with angle
brackets.
brackets.
Now here,
Now here,
um, let me
um,
just
let me
call
just
the
call
variables the variable
the variable
advice,
advice,
and then the
and then
function
the
we call it
function we call it
set
set
advice,
advice,
and
and
this is how
this
it should
is
be.
how it should be.
Now
Now,
understand that
understand that
you will
you will not be able to update your React UI without using the states because it is the state that monitors the data flow, and the state function will update the data and pass it on to the variable that will in turn display it onto the screen. I think that's the simplest way that I can explain it. So for this advice now to show on the screen, here first we are going to use this state function. All right, we're going to use it to update the data that we are returning from our API. So here I'm going to change it to set advice. In other words, let me just say that in a layman language. So at the time I'll click this button, what will happen is that the API will pull data from this API, the sync function will pull data, right? And this set advice function will get the data that is being returned, pass it onto the state variable for us to see it on the UI. So what, let me use this no paragraph. Let me change this one to something random advice. Okay, and underneath I'll use h3. So I'll open a curly brackets and then pass the advice right this way. So this is how we make use of state. Now let me click on the screen and you see that the advice. So as I continue to click, the data that is returned is passed onto our screen, constantly updated at every click using these states. So that is what we get right here on the screen. If I click, it may delay sometimes because it's network. So when network is not respecting itself, it has to take a bit to pull up the data. So up to this point, I believe that we are all on the same page. Okay. The next thing is when I refresh this page this way, you see that the advice does not show automatically unless I click this button. Now, we can do something in such a way that the advice should show, at least the first advice should show at the load of the page. So anytime that we load the page, the advice, first advice will show. Then the subsequent ones should continue showing at the click of a button. Okay, probably we change this to next advice. All right. So for us to have a data that displays on the screen at the load of the page, then we can, there are multiple ways we can go around it in React, but we can use effect to achieve that. So if under here I now call the use effects, okay, use effect takes a function, and here I'm going to use an arrow function. So what do we need to pass inside this use effects? We just need to call this a sync function.
Sorry, I have a
Okay, we
question.
need to call. Go ahead.
My question is that the API, did it contain only one object? Because normally when, because that later you use data dot sleep dot advice, they usually use for each, so that, but I didn't see for each, so that's why I'm a bit confused. so you can look.
Okay.
So you
Okay,
can look through the array.
okay. So I understand what you are saying. We are supposed to have a kind of an array of advice return and we look through them, right? Is that not what you mean?
Hello?
Okay. Yeah, I get what you are saying, but I think your network or my network is not connecting properly. So let me explain what is happening here. Why we are not looping over any object or array is because this API returns one advice at a time. So it does not return array or it does not return an array of advices, if I can put it that way. So if I should log this again, let's check what we have on the, let's check what we get on this console. So when I click, see what is returned here. If I open this, this is just a single advice. So there is no need for us to loop over array of objects because at a random, the API gives us a single advice. That is why here we are not using for each, we are just passing. What I did here is instead of returning objects, we want to access only the advice. So I use this to access our advice inside the sleep object. That's all. So if you are working, later on we'll look at that. This is just basic. Later on we'll have an array of data. Then we can either map through them, use for each, or just use another method to return that data. But this one is pretty straightforward. We do not need to map or to use for each in order to return the advice. I hope you understand what is going on here. Do we understand
Yes.
what I'm explaining? Okay, that being said, we're talking about use effects. So this use effects takes a function, and then inside this function, what we need to do here is just to call our advice sleep function. But watch what will happen. When I call this function and I'll save it. So let me reload this page. So you see, now we have a single, we have just one advice showing. But there is something that I need to, there's something I need to show us about this. Let me comment it out. Why we are having only one is because we want a situation whereby when we click, so under here, I'm going to create another, I'm going to create another state, which I'll call the count and set count. Let me just pull this over. Come on. Okay. And what I will do here, I'll just put this set count and then put it this way. And okay. And under here, in this paragraph, I've changed it to you have clicked
on
on the
button.
button 20 times.
All right.
All right.
So I want to
So
use
I want to
this
use this
count
count
this count
this
states
count
to
states to
update
update
the
the
figure here
figure here
dynamically, just to
dynamically
keep
just
count
to
of
keep
how
count
many
of how many times
our
our
button
button
is clicked.
is clicked.
So here
So
I'm going
here I'm
to
going to
pass in
pass
this
in this
count.
count.
Okay.
Okay.
So
So
at
at
the loading of
the
the
loading
screen,
of the
we have zero
screen, we
count.
have
If
zero
I
count.
click,
If I click,
it will count
it will
one.
count
If
one.
I click
If I click
again, it
again,
will count two.
it will
So it's
count two.
keeping
So it's
record of how
keeping
many
record of how
times
many times I'm clicking on this button.
Now let's go
Now
back
let's
to
go back
this
to this
use
use
effect.
effects.
I
I
would
would
uncomment
uncomment
this
this
and
and
save.
save.
Use
Use
effects. I have
effects.
to
I have to
import it
import it
here.
here.
Use
Use
effects
effects
this way.
this way.
So see what is
So
going
see
on
what
here.
is going on here.
This use
This
effect
use effect
is
is
automatically
automatically
updating,
updating,
though it is
though
not
it is not
reflecting like
reflecting
this,
like
it's
this,
changing
it's changing
gradually. See
gradually,
the
but see the
number of
number of
times
times
use
that the
effect
use effect is
trying to reload
trying to
our
reload
page
our page
into what we
into
may
what we
describe
may
as
describe as
infinite loop.
infinite loop.
Okay,
Okay,
so
so
this is
this is
how
how
the use
the use
effect
effect
tries to
tries
pull
to pull
data
data
or try
or
to
try to
update the
update the
state
states
for us.
for us.
And that is why
And that
we
is why
have
we have
the
the
dependency
dependency
array
array
that will
that will
not
not
permit the
permit
use
the use
effect to
effects to
run
run
uncontrollably. So
uncontrollably.
now that
So
I've
now that
passed
I've
the
passed the
dependency
dependency
array,
array,
it has
it
stopped
has stopped
loading on its
loading on
own
its own
without being
without being
asked to
asked
load.
to load.
But
But
notwithstanding,
notwithstanding,
this helps
this
us
helps
to
us to
update our
update our
states
states
either
either
at the
at
loading
the
of
loading of
the
the
page
page
or
or
at
at
the
the
trigger of
trigger
a
of a
particular
particular
function or
function or
event.
event.
If I
If
reload
I
this
reload
page,
this
we should
page, we
now
should not
have
have
two.
two.
Okay,
Okay,
this is
this
supposed
is
to give
supposed
us
to give us
one because
one
it's one
because
we
it's
are
one we
seeing
are
on the
seeing on the
screen.
screen.
But there is
But there is
something
something
called
called
strict
strict
mode
mode
in
in
React.
React.
That is why
That is
this is
why this
coming.
is coming,
We'll
and
talk
we'll
about
talk
that
about
later.
that later on.
So
So
this is
this
giving
is
us
giving
two
us two
additional
additional
one
one
because of that
because of that
strict mode.
strict mode.
Later
So
on,
later
when we
on, when
fix
we
it,
fix it,
we'll not be
we'll not
having
be
this
having
error
this
again.
error again.
Now, if I
Now, if
click,
I click,
everything
everything
should be
it should be
working
working
fine
fine
as it's
as it's
supposed to be.
supposed to be.
Okay,
Okay,
so up to
so
this
up to
point, I
this
think
point, I
we
think
are
we are
we are
we
good.
are good.
And the next
And
thing
the
I would like
next
to
thing
do
I would
now
like
is
to
to
do now
break
is to
this
break
into what
this
we had
into what we
before,
had
into
before,
different
into different
components.
components.
I want to
I want
break
to
this
break
into
this into
different
different
components,
components, starting
this
from
button.
this
So
button. So
I'll
I
pull
want
this
to pull out
button,
this button,
and
and
what I will
what I
do
will
is
do
to
is to
just
just
to put this
to
here,
put this here,
and then
and then
outside here
outside here
create a
I'm going to
component
create a component
button.
button, and
return
I will
this.
return this.
So
So
this seems good,
this seems
everything
good,
seems right,
everything
but
seems right,
the
but we have a
problem is
problem. The
that
problem is that
the problem we
the
have
problem
now
we have now
is
is
our button is
our
not
button is
showing,
not showing,
and the page
and the
itself,
page
nothing
itself,
is
nothing
loading
is
because it's
loading
saying that we
because it's
have
saying that
reference
we have
error.
reference error.
Advice sleep
Advice
is
sleep
not
is
defined. So
not
this
defined. So this
function that we are
function that we are
calling
calling
here
here
is not
is
being
not being
recognized by
recognized
our
by
app.
our app.
Okay,
Okay,
so for us
so
to
for us to
pass that
pass that
information,
information, let me use that word,
for us to
for us to
communicate to our
communicate to our
application that
application that,
okay,
okay,
there
there
is
is
something that we are
something that we are
using
using
elsewhere,
elsewhere.
that is
That is
where
where
props
props
come in.
come in.
So
So
we are going to
we are
use
going to use
props
props
to
now to
inform this
inform this
our
our
application
application
that
that
we have
we
a
have a
component
component
somewhere
somewhere
that it
that
should
it
listen
should
to.
listen to.
Okay,
Okay,
and
and
on
on
this
this
button,
button,
we now
we
call
now call,
we are going to pass
we are
the
going to
props
pass the
here
props here and
and pass
then
it here
pass it here
and then pass
and
it
then
down
pass
to
it
the
down to
function
the
itself.
function itself.
This is a
This is a
function that
function
we
that
are
we are
passing as a
passing as
prop.
a prop.
It is
It
not
is
a
not a
state.
state.
Okay,
Okay,
please look up
please
here.
look up here.
Our
Our
states we
states,
have
we
the
have the
advice and the
advice and the
count.
count.
The
The
advice sleep
advice
is a
sleep is a
function.
function.
So that
So
tells
that
us
tells
that
us that,
you
okay,
can
you can
also pass
also
a
pass a
function
function
as a
as
prop.
a prop.
Later,
Later, this after this
we'll
one, we'll
pass
now pass
a
a
component
component
as a
as
prop.
a prop.
So here
So
what we
here, what we
do,
do,
we just
we
have
just
to
have to
call
call
this
this
advice sleep.
advice sleep.
Let's call it
Let's call it
advice
advice
sleep,
sleep,
and
and
then
then
we
we
pass
pass
the
the
advice sleep
advice slip
right
right
inside
inside
here.
here.
Okay, so
Okay,
we're already
so
telling the
we're already
button,
telling the
all right,
button, all
button, you
right,
have to look for
button, you have to
something
look for
somewhere
something
else.
somewhere else.
Now, this
Now,
props
this
here,
props here,
we come to the
we come
button,
to the
I'll pass
button,
a
I'll pass a
parameter
parameter
called
called
props.
props.
Now, this
Now, this
function will now be
function
the
will now
property
be
of
the
this
property of this
props parameter that we
props
pass in
parameter
here.
that we pass in here.
And
And
when you're
when
accessing
you're
a
accessing
property
a
of
property of
something, you use the
something, use the
dots,
dots,
props,
props,
props
props
dots,
dots,
advice.
advice.
So
So
our code now
our
is
code now is
recognizing that there
recognizing
is
that there is
something
something
existing
existing
somewhere.
somewhere.
And if we
And if
click,
we click, everything
everything
should
should work
work
as it
as it
ought to work.
ought to work.
So this is
So
how we
this is how
use
we use
props. We can
props. We
pass
can pass
function as a
function as
prop.
a prop.
So it's
So
not
it's
only a
not only a
component.
component.
Now, let
Now, let
us
us
also
also
cut off
cut off
this
this
message.
message.
Let's cut off
Let's
this
cut off this
message
message
to
to
form
form
another
another
component just to
component,
be
just
on
to
its
be on
own.
its own.
So
So
here we're gonna
here we're
say
gonna say
function.
function. Let's call this
Message,
message,
and because
and
this is what we had
because this is what
before.
we had before.
So we're going to
So we're going to
return
return
this paragraph.
this paragraph, the
The
same
same
problem
problem
that
that
we
we had
had
earlier. Here
earlier.
is
Here
telling
it's
us
telling us
we're gonna have
we're gonna have
reference error.
reference error.
Where is that? Let's
Where is
reload
that?
this
Let's
page
reload this page
because the
because
counts
the
right here
counts right here
is not
is
working.
not
So
working.
if I
So
click,
if
you
I
see that the
click, you see
message is
that the
not
message
showing
is not
anymore.
showing anymore.
Why?
Why?
Because
Because
it is
it
not
is not,
something is
something
wrong.
is wrong.
Our
Our
state
state
seems
seems
not to be
not to be
used.
used.
Now we
Now we
use the
use
same
the
prop
same prop
to
to
pass this
pass
data
this data
down to
down
our
to our component,
or
or
to
should I say
pass
to
the
pass the
data
data
up
up
to our
to our
component. First
component.
of all, we
First
need
of
to
all,
call
we
the
need to call the
component here,
component here,
which is
which is the
message,
message,
and then
and then when we call that component,
we get
we
this
get
reference
this
error
reference
count
error
is not
count is not
defined,
defined,
and
and
here
here Let us call it counts, and then we pass the counts here. Okay, and let's save this. Right here, we pass in the props, and here this will be props dot count, and oh come on, everything should look fine. Let me reload this. All right, and then if I click, everything should be working as it's supposed to be. So we can pass in different, how do I call it? We can pass in different data as props to different components. All right. And when we now talk about the reusable components, then we'll apply the separation of concern technique in order to have these components, for example, in a separate file, or we have a file where our reusable components will be stored. We'll now import them, we use them as many times as we want. But still notwithstanding, we can reuse this button as many times as we want. In fact, so far we have looked at use states here, we have looked at use effects, and we have looked at props. So if we have any question regarding any of these things or any area of confusion, let's take that question before we continue. Okay? And like I said,
Please
our
can
today's
you explain the use effect again? The use effect.
sorry,
Please explain the use effect again.
the use effects.
Yes.
Okay. Let's do this. Let's consult the documentation right here to support whatever explanation that I'm going to give. Here we have hooks and we have use effects here. Use effect is a React hook that lets you synchronize a component with an external system. And connecting to external system. So let me start from here. We open this. This is beyond the scope of what we are discussing. But use effects, what the use effect does is this. Use effect is helping us update our states. We already know that the state, first of all, state is used to update the component UI or the UI component. Okay? But when you are using use effect will now perform a kind of an automatic synchronization of your states to ensure that your data that you are pulling from anywhere is in a real time updating on your UI. That is what this is doing. Okay, so and that is why what we are actually calling or passing inside this use effect is our function where we are calling our API, because this is where the data is coming from. And once we call this function, because here This one is updating our UI through the set advice state function, and that set advice state function is passing the data to this what is that again? It's passing the data to this H3 element here for us to see it on the screen at the click of our button. Okay, this use effect now will first of all update the UI. It will synchronize the data from the API with our use state to show us something on the screen even before we click the button. So that gives us an idea of how use effect works, that it helps us to synchronize our UI with our data real time. Without this now, our data will not show on the screen unless we clicked on the button, which means our data is not synced real time. I think this is just the easiest way that I can explain it, because initially we had our data, our advice shown only when we click on this button. Right? But when we use the use effects, we had the advice displayed anytime we load our page. It will first of all give us data pulled out from the API. Now the subsequent ones will follow at the click of this button. I don't know if another person on the call understands it better, you can lend your voice just to make sure that everybody is okay.